which is organized by the BMU Key Commission project Mainstreaming Ecosystem-based Adaptation, being implemented by GIZ, and it's organized for the International EBA Community of Practice. Today's focus is on entry points for mainstreaming ecosystem-based adaptation, and we'll discuss the cases of Peru and South Africa. So just to give you some idea of the objective, EBA is viewed as one of the principal options for countries to adapt to climate change, and however, the uptake of the concept in terms of how far it has been integrated in decision-making processes at national and subnational level, and how far it has been implemented varies considerably around the globe. So this webinar series consistent of two separate sessions aims at introducing key concepts of mainstreaming and on exchanging country experiences. So we will start with the introduction of key concepts of policy entry points and mainstreaming, which is done by my colleague Matthias Bertram from GIZ. And then Lili Ilieva is going to present the experiences from Peru. And then we have another country case from South Africa, and Tony Knowles from the Cirrus Group is going to present on this. My name is Alexandra Köngeter. I'm working as an advisor for the global project Mainstreaming EBA at GIZ. And I'm going to guide you through today's session. I would like to call your attention that this webinar session is being recorded and will be published on Adaptation Community Net. So those of you who do not agree with being recorded, I would please ask you to leave the webinar room and to see the recordings later on Adaptation Community Net. Thank you very much. On the left-hand side, you will see a chat box, a chat functions, where you can type in your questions and also when you have technical problems. And we will try to address those and come back to you by email if it's required. So you could also leave your email address if there are technical problems. And with no further ado, I think we go to our first input already, and this will be by Matthias Bertram. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Alexandra, for this introduction. And hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. I hope you can hear me well. My name is Matthias Bertram. I'm working as an advisor for ecosystem-based adaptation in the GIZ Global Project, Mainstreaming EBA, which is funded under the International Climate Initiative by the BMU, the German Federal Ministry for Environment. I would basically start with the first introduction into the topic, into mainstreaming of EBA, and also what we define as entry points. And as Alexandra mentioned, later on, Lili Ilieva and Tony Knowles will explain to you two examples from our partner countries, from Peru and South Africa. So EBA mainstreaming, what does it actually mean, mainstreaming? Well, we define it as a systematic integration of climate change risks, like floods, like droughts, like extreme events or slow onset events, and adaptation responses to that by using ecosystem services, because this is actually what EBA is all about, using ecosystems and the services that they provide to help people to adapt to climate change. And mainstreaming EBA means basically to integrate these ideas, these concepts into sectoral work, into sectoral policies, strategies, programs, and practice, for instance, from the agriculture sector, fisheries, forestry, mining, energy, and so on, but also very importantly, cross-sectoral policies, sustainable development, the SDGs, for example, poverty reduction strategies, climate change adaptation and mitigation. So it's a huge policy arena you can imagine where EBA mainstreaming can happen. And of course, we all understand that this is very country specific, very project specific as well. So in our project and also in the entry point analysis that we did, we also looked into specific sectors or contexts where ecosystem-based adaptation could be mainstreamed. And the overall goal is, of course, to help people to enhance the well-being and livelihoods of people and secure it in the face of climate-related risks now and in the future. So it's a very complex setting. The final goal is to use natural solutions or ecosystem-based approaches, take them into account in development strategies. So mainstreaming is rather an action and process to take ecosystem services into account in various strategies, for instance, in water provision and quality, in food production, in finance strategies, education, health and human well-being. So this graph that you can see here on the right side, it looks a bit like a dartboard. So that's also what colleagues from the CBD told us. This dartboard is part of a CBD chapter, the Voluntary Guidelines of Ecosystem-based Adaptation, which have been endorsed under the recent biodiversity negotiations. So basically to find your space to navigate and to make the case for ecosystem-based approaches in your country, I think this is an interesting reference. And the country studies have also analyzed very specific strategies and sectors where EBA can be mainstreamed. So in a study that our project conducted, we focused on the assessment of entry points and governance systems. So very practical settings in which ecosystem-based adaptation approaches can be integrated. We did a study in 5 partner countries, Mexico, Peru, Philippines, Vietnam, and South Africa. These countries are very diverse, very different social economic settings, very different governance systems, but they have 2 things in common. They are highly vulnerable towards current and future climate change impacts, and they also are hosts of mega biodiversity. So they are very high biodiverse countries, rich in ecosystems, in various species, and so on. So nature ecosystem services can play a very potential role for those countries to adapt to climate change. The study was implemented in collaboration with Ambero Consulting and an interdisciplinary consultant team led by Tora Armand and also Lily Ilieva, who will present today, and Tony Knowles have been part of our country teams. And we asked a very basic key question. So what kind of set of policies, measures, and governance structures does it actually take for making EBA happen in very concrete settings? And as an underlying module, we used a module which is called the 3-stream approach. It's a model which is frequently used in political sciences to understand decision making, and it consists of 3 different streams which have to come together. So the first one, which you can see here on the top, is what we call the problem stream. If there is a public awareness on climate change impacts, for instance, like risk of floods or even existing floods or droughts or other impacts on people, if this public awareness is there, this is what we call the problem stream. The second one is the solution stream. So are there any proposals, strategies, or decision-making processes that can help to overcome the problem? Are there technical solutions? Are there policies in place? And if these 2 streams come together, we define it as a problem window. So there is a combination of public awareness, let's say an existing flood, and an adaptation solution, how to deal with a flood. The third stream is even more interesting because this is the political stream. So is there any interest of acting powers, for instance, triggered by very specific mandates and election terms? Is a government behind a certain action? Is a business sector behind a certain action? And if all these streams come together, we call it the policy window. So a combination of public awareness, let's say a flood, an adaptation solution, which can be protection of forests or the construction of dikes or retention infrastructure, and the mandate by government and other actors. If those elements come together, then you have the perfect window of opportunity to influence and support change. You have an entry point. And these kind of entry points, they can occur at various different levels of governance. So if we talk about governance, we clearly say governance goes beyond government. So it's not only the responsibility of the government to solve all problems, but you have to find alliances, multi-stakeholder settings to deal with certain issues. And for this issue, we have come up with an illustration to showcase which different actors are actually involved in governance issues. You clearly have the state on the right-hand side, and the key role of the state is to create favorable political, legal, and economic environments, and to engage society and various groups in activities and policies. So the state is setting the framework conditions. But you have civil society, of course, on the left-hand side, a huge and diverse group of actors who are mobilizing people's participation as stakeholders, but also rights holders to public services like ecosystem services. And they are also driving business. They are consuming. So you have a huge set of different actors from social organizations, media, academia, community organizations who have to be part of a solution, of a process. And then finally, the private sector at the bottom, also very diverse and creating opportunities for people and for the environment. So the private sector is also a key actor for governance, also for the governance of public goods, ecosystem services, and other products by nature. And there are multiple opportunities also in the sustainable management of ecosystems for the business sector, for investors, for producers, retailers, insurances, because many of them already realize that their knowledge, that their products, their goods are highly depending on ecosystem services and are at a high risk due to climate change. So this combination of different actors in the governance system was very interesting for us to analyze in the 5 countries, and Lily and Tony will further elaborate on this during their presentations, because they have also set up what we call governance matrices, which are clearly showcasing the development of EBA mainstreaming in the countries. So the 4 studies on entry points that I've mentioned, the country reports, they are already available on our online platform, the Adaptation Community Net. All of these materials are accessible online, and 2 of them will be presented today in the webinar, and another one will be presented in the follow-up webinar. And with this, I would like to hand over to Alexandra again. And if you have questions for clarification, I'm happy to reply to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for this very comprehensive overview on the mainstreaming concept, and also for introducing the studies we're going to present in the course of this webinar and the next session, end of August. We will have a longer discussion after all presentations, but I would like to encourage you to ask your clarification questions right now using the chat box. So clarification questions are those you wish to discuss to follow the further presentations. And where on the left-hand side below, there is a chat box, so you can type in your questions. Those, and we will try to organize them and to read them out loud so that the speaker can present. I see there's no questions so far, but somebody might be typing at the very moment. So let's just hold on for some seconds. And those who would like to ask questions later on, there will be further room for discussions. And also during the presentations, you're already encouraged to type in your comments, your questions, also to share further links if you wish so. There's this chat box which will help you to organize this. Okay, thank you very much. I see there's no need for clarification, so excellent job, Matthias. Thank you very much for your presentation. And with this, we would move on and travel to Peru, to Latin America. and hear from Lily Ilyeva what experiences they have on entry points for mainstreaming ecosystem-based adaptation. And with this, Lily, I would like to ask you to take over as a presenter. And yeah, thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Maybe you can write as well. Okay, great. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to take part in this webinar. Thanks to Matthias as well for giving this excellent introduction to the topic and to the global study on entry points for mainstreaming EBA. I'm very happy to present what are the lessons learned from the case study analysis from Peru. Maybe just shortly in a nutshell, that the analysis was conducted through reviewing a wide range of policy instruments and mechanisms in the country, as well as focus group discussions with key stakeholders and in-depth interviews with stakeholders that are involved in EBA implementation and planning on national or regional local level, as well as other stakeholders that are at the moment not involved in EBA but are interested in. So, well, based on these let's say process, I'm really happy to share with you some of the results. First of all, I would like to start with a very quick overview on the Peru's country profile on climate risk and vulnerability. You may see I have included two maps that are showing variation of precipitation and temperature according to climate projections for 2030. Well, you may see the one, the map which is on the left is refers to temperature variation, and the map on the right refers to a precipitation variation. I have identified, well, Peru is highly vulnerable to climate variability, and it's exposed to a wide range of extreme events, including floods and droughts. But as well, including El Niño and La Niña, as you may have heard in 2017, resulting in severe socio-economic and environmental impacts. I have highlighted some of the other factors that actually make the country that vulnerable. The combination of climate-sensitive economy sectors as agriculture and fishing, as well as the poverty levels and inequality, especially for the rural population, having in mind the high diversity of the country, but as well the fragile ecosystems, as the low coastal areas, arid and semi-arid zones, as well as the Amazon region. And here I also refer to the institutionality, or, well, at the moment, a rather fragmented institutional setting, having in mind as well current policy aspects in the country. So given this combination of those factors, the country is considering as well that climate change has to be a priority in order to address many different issues in the country, one of which would be definitely sustainable development and addressing poverty levels. You may see as well on the right side, I have included a table which presents the climate risks and potential impacts for the Amazon, coastal, and Andean region. I wouldn't go very much in depth in this aspect, just a representation seeing what could be those potential impacts for the different regions. A very urgent issue for the country is water availability. There is either too much or too little water in the country, depending on the geographical area you would go. This is further jeopardized by the climate variability that affects rural and urban livelihoods in a range of ways. So it is pivotal to take adaptation actions and respond to this potential climate impacts. And it has been recognized on a national level that water availability and access is a key sector to be addressed. So with this, I would like to go further with a description of the policy landscape with regards to climate change in a nutshell, and how Peru responds with EBA. I wouldn't go in details on this table, but you can see the timelines as well as what are the climate change policies, the planning instruments, and regional policies that have been at place or currently being introduced, as well as the EBA projects. I have highlighted in orange the policy instruments and advances which are relevant to EBA, one of which is the law on mechanisms for compensation for ecosystem services, which recognizes the role of ecosystem services for human well-being. And further on, as you may see, EBA projects start to be more and more implemented. The EBA Mountain Project, EBA Amazonia, EBA Lomas. This is a specific ecosystem in Peru. EBA Coasts and the mainstreaming EBA and strengthening EBA in planning and decision making processes. And with the implementation of those projects, more and more evidence starts to be visible, and you may see that more and more policies are relevant to EBA are taking place. It is the NDCs which consider EBA actions, the very new law on climate change, which also has EBA action considerations. And something I will talk further on, the highlight for the case study of Peru is how natural infrastructure is integrated explicitly as a criteria for public investment projects. Here is also to mention that on a regional level, there have been so far 18 regional governments out of 25, if I'm not mistaken, that already have regional climate change strategies, and they are starting to implement EBA projects. So this is very, very briefly what is, let's say, the policy landscape of the country, in order to give an overview of what is the context in which we are aiming to identify entry points for EBA mainstreaming. So this analysis actually argues that EBA mainstreaming may occur at any governance level, as already Matthias mentioned, local, regional, or national, in a search to complement policies and actions through experiences, evidence, knowledge, and practices. The assessment aims to identify and understand planning processes, what are the key actors, their key roles, the policy setting, and that can be relevant to EBA mainstreaming initiative. It also, well, it followed an analysis taking in consideration the 4 main stages of policy cycle, which are the national agenda setting, sector policy formulation, resource allocation, and implementation, considering that it both top-down and bottom-up approaches. So it is, of course, as well aligned with the Peruvian government policy cycle, policy development cycle. And here you may see 2 of the looking at the policy agenda setting, identifying on a national agenda setting and regional agenda setting what could be the entry points. The results of the assessment show that there are a number of entry points for EBA. Mainstreaming across the across all of the policy cycle stages, and well, given on a national agenda setting, given that the national adaptation plan will be the implementation mechanisms for the NDCs. On adaptation, it is very crucial that EBA approach is integrated as a cross-setting element. And as it is currently in its formulation phase, the NAP process, there is a great potential for the integration of EBA across the whole process of assessing climate vulnerability and identifying adaptation options, reviewing and prioritizing adaptation options, as well as reporting and monitoring. So this is certainly an entry point to be considered. As well as reinforcing EBA-related measures and commitments when integrating the NAP into sectoral planning. On a regional scale, on the other hand, it was identified that there is an opportunity for strengthening the EBA case at basin and landscape scale, as regional policies and governance are looking or are providing this opportunity for having a rather landscape approach for a policy implementation. So it is therefore having in mind that landscape scale is one of let's say the scale most appropriate for EBA implementation in order to benefit most from its multiple benefits. This is an opportunity for integrating EBA in the regional agenda, looking especially at the regional strategies for climate change and the regional development plans. Further on, you may see different sectors and identification of what are the entry points for mainstreaming EBA in those sectors. 3 of the prioritized sectors in the NDCs are analyzed to provide an opportunity for entry points for EBA mainstreaming are agriculture, forestry, and water and sanitation. Moreover, 2 additional areas demonstrate that there is also high potential for promoting EBA, which are the protected areas and disaster risk reduction. So to safeguard this phase of the process and to promote cross-sectoral mainstreaming of EBA, it is recommended, or it should be considered, to align the sectoral policies with national and regional adaptation processes, of course, and safeguard these cross-sectoral synergies, for example, between agroforestry, water, and water or forestry practices. Well, just to provide a short introduction about the entry points for each of those sectors. For example, for agriculture, well, this sector has made many efforts already in formulating and implementing climate change adaptation initiatives, and many of which highlight the role of ecosystems and the need for sustainable practices. So here, 2 of the possible entry points after analyzing the policy instruments already existent could be the integration of EBA aspects in the design of water management practices in order to prevent desertification and reduce flood risk for agriculture. And another one could be to document evidence of the role of ecosystems for food security in order to reinforce EBA consideration in local and regional policies. With regards to forestry, well, in climate-related policies in the country, forest conservation initiatives were seen primarily as part of mitigation strategies rather than adaptation strategies. However, the restoration of degraded lands through reforestation practices can actually help building synergies in between mitigation and adaptation objectives. And therefore, it was highlighted that being part of the Bond Challenge, Peru is committed to recovering 3.5 million hectares of degraded areas, both as plantations for commercial purposes and for recovery of ecosystem functions. It is therefore proposed to consider EBA principles in restoration and degraded land of degraded lands. afterwards, some examples from the protected areas. National protected areas play a fundamental role in the implementation of climate change adaptation and mitigation measures. There are already examples of EBA in the Amazonia and EBA Mountain, which are both being implemented in protected areas and have demonstrated very good results. It is, however, there are opportunities for more steps to be done. This is to include EBA measures as an integral part of the master plans for protected areas and also in their budgeting processes to ensure sustainability, as well as use co-management agreements with indigenous and local communities. This is a practice that Peru is implementing, however, not taking in consideration specific EBA criteria or principles. So this could be an opportunity to integrate EBA in the implementation of those community nature reserve plans. And on water and sanitation, well, as I mentioned, this is actually one of the priority sectors for Peru. And it has a multi-sectoral importance, both for agriculture, for food security, for health. Therefore, policy developments on climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction should be taken in consideration. And it is here that EBA can be considered as a nature infrastructure, as an alternative or a hybrid option to ensure sustainable and more cost-efficient water resource management. And with regards to disaster risk reduction, well, although it is a priority issue for Peru, and there have been already certain advances in disaster risk management, it has been seen that there is only limited reference to ecosystem approaches as potential solution to disasters. Therefore, one of the possibilities to integrate EBA and an entry point could be to integrate it as a component of investment projects and plans for disaster risk reduction, and especially for recovery and reconstruction. It is as well at the moment a new law was passed after 2017 impacts from the floods and landslides in the country. So it is an opportunity and a window of opportunity as well for EBA to become part of an eco-DRR, disaster risk reduction and strategies in the country. Well, here is Matthias mentioned, and he had a bit nicer version of the momentum of windows of opportunity. Just to mention, well, in the case of Peru, the window of opportunity and actually the problem stream, as mentioned already, is the climate variability and risk, specifically with regards to water availability. The proposal stream at this moment was the pilot EBA mountain project. I hope you have heard of it. It was implemented in Peru, in Nepal, and Uganda. For more information, probably we can share after the presentation. But it was the first EBA like flagship project implemented in Peru. Therefore, there was very valuable evidence of the role of natural infrastructure for water resource management being implemented in highly vulnerable areas and working with working in a natural protected area. And with this, the political stream, it is where you may see two key actors, is the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Economy and Finance. It is a very interesting combination of actors working very, very well, and it's kind of a notable advance in promoting EBA on a national and regional local level. So actually the window of opportunity was to integrate natural infrastructure in public investments. I will talk a little bit more on that. Yes. So we talked about the regulatory and planning framework, which are critical enabling factors for mainstreaming EBA across governance levels and sectors. However, in the absence of financial and other resources, stakeholders are unable to actually implement actions on the ground. Therefore, the budget allocation process is the central entry point for EBA mainstreaming, and especially for the Peru case study. Well, the government's budget process is the central, let's say, access for resource allocation, and is therefore important in terms of ensuring budget that consider the financial resources which are needed for the planning, implementation, and monitoring of EBA measures. Here you may see on this image, I have even put on the left side some of the aspects that have been considered: so climate change and disaster risk reduction, rural development, biodiversity and ecosystem services, and the idea or the need to integrate EBA principles in the criteria for formulation and implementation of public investment projects in sector and territorial planning. So this becomes possible through the national system of multi-annual programming and management of investments. It is a very long system or national system that was created in 2017, or was improved in 2017, and it is known as the INVIERTE-P. So it is. It has developed different regulations. It incorporates the concept of natural infrastructure. And it establishes explicitly that natural infrastructure can be considered part of the public infrastructure projects, which are in turn part of a multi-year investment plans. And this is, of course, an opportunity for more sustainable funding of EBA initiatives. So some of the key well, in 2015, a joint work between the Ministry of Economy and Finance, as mentioned before, and the Ministry of Environment, together with the National Service of Natural Protected Areas and other national and international actors, led to the elaboration of policy guidelines for public investment in biodiversity and ecosystem services. These policy guidelines promote biodiversity and ecosystem conservation measures in formulating and implementing of public investment at local, regional, and national level. So this is kind of the instrument that has been considered in order to include key criteria and key indicators in possible public projects where ecosystem services and biodiversity considerations will be integrated. Well, and the result is, as mentioned before, that natural infrastructure makes part of planning and public investment. As mentioned earlier, well, EBA mainstreaming can be driven and supported at different governance levels. And as you saw with this window of opportunity, there were different actors that actually took role in order to, let's say, push this the EBA consideration on the agenda, on the national agenda. So it was highly interesting to understand better what are the different governance levels and the different stakeholders. And in that sense, there are different sets of actors that can hold key roles in EBA governments and mainstreaming, as Matthias was mentioning. In order to understand this panorama in Peru, 4 case studies were identified and further analyzed. They highlight that the priority issue is to be recognized is that there are different governance levels, and there is in order to acknowledge and to promote the potential of nature-based solutions. You may see on this table the name of the 4 selected case studies and the EBA measures being considered. They are further discussed in the publication of the case study. As Matthias also mentioned, we looked at what is the governance of EBA and prepared the governance matrix. You may see here that we have separated it into kind of 4 possible governance models. Let's say one to be the first one, governance by the government, shared governance, private governance, indigenous and local community governance. It is considered that EBA mainstreaming can be driven and supported at different government levels, as mentioned, and it's important to understand what's the motivation of the stakeholders. This is why you may see the different circles and different colors, which annotate which actor has initiated the process. So this is the number 1 in yellow. The number 2 in blue is the stakeholder who followed the process, and number 3 in orange is the stakeholder who sustained the process. So in order to achieve long-lasting change, both at the policy level and on the ground, collaboration across the different levels of governance and sectors is crucial, and we have seen this evidence from those 4 case studies. I will not have the time to go through all of the details of the 4 case studies, but you will be able to read more about them in the publication. It is just here to give an overview that each of the case study presented a certain governance model, and we looked at how these different actors in each case cooperated and what were their roles and mandates, how were the decisions taken, who was accountable, and what maintains the interest of the partners in EBA or mainstreaming of EBA. We looked at the flagship EBA Mountain project, which is at the national level, and there is also an external agent, the UNDP. The regional, on the regional level, which is and shared governance model, is the recovery of a project called the recovery of hydrological ecosystem services from forests and grasslands. And at the regional and local level, and there is a private governance with a hydroelectric company, an electricity supplier, working on reforestation and recovery of degraded ecosystems. And at local level, with indigenous governance, the EBA Amazonia project, which is working with local communities and indigenous communities. Well, based on findings from the analysis, we came up with identifying what have been the enabling and hindering factors for EBA mainstreaming. An enabling environment is vital, of course, for effective mainstreaming of EBA in development planning. And key enabling factors that support the process refer mostly to institutional arrangements, the policy framework and the capacities, individual and institutional, as well as the availability and access to information. Although significant progress in climate change governance and implementation tools have been achieved in Peru, we also recognize that there is still need for further improvement of the policy and the institutional framework. And you may see on on the figure some of the key enabling factors and hindering factors. As enabling factors, we identified that leadership at national and sectoral levels that has the potential power to allocate domestic funds for the promotion of EBA has been like a leading element in the case of Peru. As well as building partnerships through national dialogues and mechanisms for intersectoral collaboration, which has been implemented under the NDC's process implementation and development and implementation process in the country. Another, under policy framework, we identified that there is already an established policy framework for climate change and nature conservation, which makes it much easier to identify entry points for EBA mainstreaming. Also, there are the guidelines for public project investments that promote green infrastructure, as mentioned already under the multi-annual planning system in Peru. With regards to awareness and capacity, capacity building program on climate change is being institutionalized, and it provides tailored training. It concentrates rather on local public officials in order to enable them to be able to design and to implement EBA according to their development planning. And with regards to availability and access to information, well, at the moment, there is a community-led and highly participatory research approach with regards to EBA, and it's central in understanding the local reality and generate data. So this is based on the evidence from the projects being implemented so far. However, there are some barriers with regards to institutional framework. Although the actors I mentioned, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Finance and Economy, they work together. However, there is some difficulty in finding the common language and methodologies and tools on EBA, which may hinder the whole process of mainstreaming or promoting EBA. There is an overlap of institutional mandates at national, regional, and local scale as well that was noticed through analyzing some of the policy instruments. The policy framework, there is a limited horizontal and vertical coherence of policies, which to a certain extent also hinder the implementation and promotion of EBA actions. And also, implementation of regional strategies on climate change are not always very well articulated with other policies. And it is something that I understand that the national actors are working on to improve it. Awareness and capacity, there is limited technical capacity of the national institutions, specifically to support the evaluation and implementation of EBA initiatives. So we mentioned that there is there are advances in integrating ecosystem services related indicators in proposal development for projects for public investment. However, there is the limited technical capacity in actually saying that, all right, this project is responding to EBA criteria and EBA principles. So this is another barrier. And also with regards to availability and access to information, there is a limited availability of accurate and downscaled information on climate change, which it's a common problem in most emerging developing countries, and which sometimes spurs the whole process of vulnerability analysis and identification of adaptation measures. Having to sum up or to wrap up, there are several key considerations that need to be taken into account for EBA mainstreaming process. And a preliminary step is to raise awareness among actors at all relevant sectors. And here, the recommendations are structured into three key categories, let's say: implementation on the ground, integration at regional level, and framework conditions on the national level. So we looked at what are the lessons learned, what have we seen from the assessment in Peru with regards to implementation on the ground. And one point was that before taking actions on scaling up EBA measures, it is a prerequisite to integrate the variable on climate change and risk into the management and strategic instruments of sectors and land use planning. So this is kind of a step before we would like to promote and to strengthen EBA implementation. Another element was forest landscape restoration. It is a national priority, and it can be transformed into a powerful strategy and tool for EBA mainstreaming with regards to its implementation when it is done under certain EBA criteria. With regards to integration at regional level, well, taking into consideration the complex dynamics of ecosystems and services they provide, EBA planning and implementation works best at landscape level, as mentioned, and hence regional integration and transboundary coordination between countries would be crucial. So one step forward could be to enable this, especially for the Amazon and the Andean regions, to enable this regional integration and collaboration with regards to EBA. And on framework conditions on the national level, well, a common EBA roadmap needs to be made as an integral part of the National Adaptation Plan. This said, as there are a lot of initiatives taking place in the country, a lot of studies are being done and a lot of actions are being taken for the promotion and the integration of EBA different processes. However, not necessarily it has been done on a very strategic way, looking at what is the final point that wants to be reached. It is therefore such a common EBA roadmap could show, let's say, the way on how to best take the necessary steps in order to have a better or more effective upscaling and or broad scaling of EBA. Yes, and so as well, innovative financing mechanisms and collaboration with the private sector would be key for EBA at the long run. Well, this said, I would like to thank you. I think I have extended a little bit my time. Thank you very much for the attention. And I would be happy to respond your questions. And if you would like some more details, you may find my contact. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lily, for this really deep dive into the Peruvian case and this details on how far mainstreaming has succeeded there so far. There are already some questions in the chat box. Thanks for the participants to ask questions. We will address those later on in the general discussion after the second case presentation from South Africa. Just a comment in between. Many from the agricultural experts, which stresses that many ecosystems are not natural anymore but shaped by agriculture, and that needs to be accounted for in promoting of agricultural management systems and promotion of EBA in agriculture. And there have been some links shared, for example, on concrete EBA examples at the Panorama.Solutions platform, a knowledge platform to exchange on case studies and also studies which give further insights on key policy and institutional and capacity-related challenges and opportunities at the IIED platform. Thank you very much for sharing this, and we're coming to the discussion after the second presentation. And this is now the time to travel further and to go to South Africa and see what experiences have been done there so far. With EBA mainstreaming. And while the presentation is charging, I would like to invite Tony Knowles to unmute your microphone. Tony, I think it's already working. Your microphone is bluish. Yes.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, of course. I can hear you excellently. I think this is working fine. I will go through your slides, so please indicate yes or next, and I move onwards. Thank you very much, Tony. You have the word.
Okay, thanks very much, and good day to all of you, and thank you for the opportunity to present. And at the start, I must also express my thanks to GIZ and Tora and Arno and the team that provided us with the opportunity and all the support through the project. It's been a very interesting scope of work. If we could just move on to the next slide, please. I think you're all aware of the background to this project. Next. Okay. Yeah. As you're all aware, it's essentially an analysis of how EBA has been mainstreamed into different countries, why certain countries have taken up with great gusto and others have not, and the manner in which it has been adopted to date. Next. I'm just moving through the initial slides quickly, so it's not to repeat earlier presentations. But the opportunity for EBA in South Africa is very clear. We are in a part of the world that's certainly going to be affected by climate change. We are already being affected, and in general, the country is going to become a lot warmer with an increasing frequency of extreme events, particularly floods and droughts. Next. With that, sorry, my presentation just got stuck there for a moment. But with that, there's very clear opportunity for EBA. Across South Africa, there's extensive land degradation. We have over 1 million hectares of deep erosion gullies across the country. But the areas in which these are located and where much the land degradation is located is where our principal ecosystem services come from. They typically are high mountainous areas. They're areas in which the poorer communities live. And these are areas that are vital to our water security and our food security. On that map, that top map, those little circled areas are our key water areas. And there was an analysis done by WWF which shows that over 50% of South Africa's water comes from less than 8% of the surface. And unfortunately, those are the areas that are heavily degraded. Next, please. So there's been a good long history of focus on climate change and environmental matters. South Africa prides itself on the progressive nature of our policies. Our water acts, our environmental management acts are known for their progressive nature globally. And at an early stage, we took a progressive approach to climate change. And one can see this through our engagements at the UNFCCC over the years, where South Africa has often taken targets and that at an early stage. But over the years, there's been a shift from just pure mitigation to adaptation, as many of you are aware, and as was shown in the previous presentation. And there's been an increase in focus on ecosystem-based adaptation. And following early projects in KwaZulu-Natal and elsewhere that I'll get onto a little bit later, South Africa developed an initial strategic framework and overarching implementation plan, and then last year developed a set of guidelines for EBA in the country. Go on to the next slide, please. And those, and in recognition of ecosystem-based adaptation and ecosystem-based mitigation goes beyond just the environmental laws, the green laws. It's also included within our national development plan and many of the other sectoral plans outside of the green sector. It's well recognized that ecosystem services and natural capital are important to the country. And thankfully, we have a strong set of academics who started many years ago with the Millennium Assessment and other assessments to communicate the importance of ecosystem services and land use-based approaches to responding to climate change to government. And this is reflected in many of our national acts. So in terms of mainstreaming, our policy is quite progressive, but it's really a case of now trying to implement it. Next slide, please. With this project, in a similar manner to the Peru one, we identified 5 case studies through which to explore how EBA has been developed to date. At the particular entry point, which part of civil society or the private sector or government initiated it, and it's been quite an interesting process to see all the different ways in which it's coming to South Africa. Next slide, please. And could I actually ask you to jump forward another slide to case study 2, and I'll come back to case study 1. The reason I asked to jump forward to this case study is that I believe that EBA really started off in South Africa with this project in KwaZulu-Natal, which has been run by eThekwini municipality or Durban municipality. And I was actually there at the time when we were standing on the Umfolozi riverbank, focusing on community-based reforestation activities. And I think, as many of you have probably experienced in those early days of reforestation projects or CDM projects, is that it was quite difficult to make them viable. And myself and Deborah Roberts of eThekwini municipalities, who's led all of their work, and Andrew Fento of the Wildlands Conservation Trust to actually implement their non-profit agency, we're trying to work out how we could possibly make the project successful. And I think it was Deborah that highlighted that, trying to make it work and sell it as a mitigation project is quite difficult. But if you take a step back, the real opportunity is adaptation, and it's a real way in which communities can assist in helping themselves as well as downstream communities and economies and urban centers to adapt to climate change. And it was there that the term CEBA, or Community Ecosystem-based Adaptation, was coined. This was about a good 10 years ago. It was before the Durban COP. And that's where it all really started. Over the years, EBA has become more prevalent and the community component up front has been dropped. But that's where it really all started in South Africa. Where it grew from there was to a much broader set of activities. So within the municipality, they initially started with reforesting degraded areas, and since then it's expanded into a vast suite of different projects that have been developed in an opportunistic manner, but in a bottom-up organic manner. So at the moment, the projects range from the restoration of forest and grassland areas within the municipal domain to the clearance of alien invasive species on riparian and riverine areas, And they use a variety of models in those areas. Some of it is through national implementation teams linked to the Expanded Public Works program that come in and clear alien invasives, but a lot of it's done through local residents and local communities and the municipality itself. At the same time, they are very open to bringing in local NGOs like Wildlands to do parts of it. Okay, could I ask you to go back one slide, please, to case study 1? Now, this case study really grew out of the Durban experience. Durban is at the bottom of the Umgeni catchment. And it didn't take long for Deborah and others in Durban to realize that if you want to secure the future of Durban and decrease its exposure to climate change, that you need to focus on the entire catchment. And they started engaging with parties further and further up the catchment and started working with SANBI, which is the South African National Biodiversity Institute, to look at the creation of a catchment scale program. And that is just getting going. It got going about 2-3 years ago, but it's still in an early stage where they engage in with a broad variety of landowners and land managers, some private landowners, some traditional authorities that are governing areas under communal land tenure. But it's a real mosaic of different land tenure types, land management types, and land cover types, from open grasslands to intensive crop production to urban areas, and so on and so forth. As mentioned, as mentioned, it's been implemented through a broad set of parties, and it's got a high potential for mainstreaming. It's really seen as one of the poster projects in the country that could be replicated to every other catchment. Okay, could we go forward 2 slides, please? Thanks. The Upper Breda catchment is a different type of project. It's really based on the land care program. This project's occurring in the Western Cape down towards Cape Town, and land care is a project or a program. It's a national program that's being developed by the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, and its primary aim was to rehabilitate agricultural land. So the state typically works with farmers to implement measures on their farms. They either send in external crews to, say, fill up erosion gullies or clear alien invasives or restore land, whatever it is, or they pay the farmer the marginal costs of employing their staff in the down season to do those sort of tasks. So typically any farm, be it a crop farm, fruit farm, will have a down season in which labour is not used at capacity, and they pay the farmers labour costs during those months, so that the labour can actually work on that restoration. So the project initially focused on restoring the land that the farmers own, but has since developed to a point where the farmers are now restoring land around their farms. In this particular catchment, the Breda River, it's often heavily degraded, often heavily bush encroached and invaded by alien invasive plants. So in this context, the farmers are clearing those alien invasive plants adjacent to their farms and clearing sections of river. What is nice about this project from an EBA mainstreaming point of view is that you see how a project like this has actually led to a significant shift in values and knowledge over time within the valley, because a few years ago farmers knew very little about ecosystem-based adaptation and ecosystem services more broadly. But now it's got to a point where last year one of the farmers in the valley started ploughing too far up a slope and started ploughing indigenous lands. And without going to the authorities, his neighbors had a meeting with him and in a casual manner basically called him to account and explained that, you know, ploughing those areas is not the best. It's going to cause erosion on their lands down the slope, and please stop it. So it's really moving towards that broader shift in value, rules and knowledge that you would desire within a landscape. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a similar project, a case study 4. It's also in the Breda River Valley. It's implemented by WWF, which is, many of you know, is one of the large conservation NGOs, and likewise they are working with commercial farmers and civil society organizations, the catchment, to manage it and to basically clear any invasive plants and clear litter. Next slide. The last case study is the Umthombobo catchment. This is a catchment located in the Eastern Cape, and it's mainly communal land, but it's in a part of the country that's perhaps has the highest levels of poverty and highest levels of degradation. And it's a project that started in response to a new dam in the region. The Department of Water Affairs needs to put a dam in towards the bottom of the catchment for agricultural and urban needs. And what they found after quick analysis is that if they left the catchment in the degraded state it is, that dam would have silted up within 3 to 5 years. So they've taken the progressive step of first restoring the entire catchment before building the dam. And that's where this project came from. In terms of governance, the local university there, the Rhodes University Restoration Group, are leading the process. And it's taking some time. They're taking the classical true bottom-up engagement process, and it is taking time, but initial implementation is starting to happen. But it's from the initial development, it looks like it will be implemented through a combination of the local residents, civil society, as well as local NGOs, with some help from national government through the Expanded Public Works Program. Okay, next slide. Okay, lessons to date. And my apologies for going through this quite quickly. I'm acutely aware of the time. The principal lesson that we observed across all of the case studies, both the 5 presented here as well as the other cases of implementation that we observed, is that most of it is driven by a particular champion in a bottom-up manner. Most of it hasn't been in response to a national mandate or national policies, and therefore it's quite difficult to replicate. Okay. We've also found that there's great opportunity to leverage existing private sector and public sector capacity. Okay. But it's going to need a different type of language to communicate it to those parties. For example, local municipalities and commercial farmers have the capacity to implement, but they may not be interested in ecosystem-based adaptation per se, but rather in risk reduction that could reduce their exposure. So I think that's one of the key things is the manner in which it's communicated. And then lastly, we need a a national monitoring framework to be built around us, because where parties to date have implemented, there's very few. There's very little monitoring happening, and therefore it's difficult to communicate how effective or efficient EBA is. And it becomes particularly tricky when you're engaging with funders and with Treasury and others, where one's trying to substantiate EBA and why you need funds and why you should be implementing it. Okay, if we can move on to the following slide, please. Okay, in terms of the policy institutional capacity, supporting implementation and field implementation, as mentioned, we have very strong progressive policies in South Africa, but the issue is the lack of realization. Okay, government has recently commissioned an action plan for EBA, which will hopefully address a lot of that, but it is still a clear issue. In addition to that, we did highlight the need for additional institutional capacity and supporting capacity. And what we mean by this is that there's a lot of parties out there that are working on topics related to EBA. There's various institutions within government, be it departments of agriculture, departments of environmental affairs, all the expanded public works programs, but there's little coordination across them, and there's great opportunity to leverage existing capacity if you have a unit that can facilitate that and can manage it over time. So, typically when one met with the parties within government or private sector or civil society, parties indicated that they're keen to partake in a program. They would be completely open to using their staff at a particular time of year to implement a certain set of measures. Other parties highlighted the need for a monitoring program. They highlighted the need for an incentives program. They highlighted the need for alignment with policy at different levels, etc. But one of the more resounding questions or pivotal questions was, who's going to do all of that? And that's something that's currently missing, is that institutional capacity and that supporting capacity to facilitate all those functions that I've just mentioned. And without that, I don't think we're going to meet a good comprehensive national EBA program. Next slide. Okay, I think I've covered much of this, and I know there's a clear time pressure, so please move on to the last slide. Okay. To sum up, I think the slide after this is just a concluding slide, but we identified essentially 4 entry points. Okay. The first is to bring EBA into national policy and strategy more clearly. As mentioned, we do have good policies, but there's a need to coordinate across sectors. So we have good, strong environmental policies, but at the same time, we have mining and development policies that clash with those. So at a policy level, we need improved interdepartmental planning and conversations and implementation. The second clear entry point is spatial planning at a catchment scale, and this very much focuses on halting deforestation, halting degradation before it actually starts. Okay, while we have certain parties that are making great progression with the implementation of restoration measures in certain landscapes, in other landscapes we have areas that are being cleared for development or conventional farming, etc., that really work against the principles of EBA or principles of what we're trying to do, and spatial planning could happen in a much more efficient and effective manner. The third point and the fourth point are related, in that as I emphasized on the previous slide, there is good capacity in several sectors that can be leveraged, but there is a need for management at a catchment scale, and also supporting capacity that manages EBA at both the local, provincial, and national scale. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for this presentation. Sorry, I think you can't hear me. I hope it's better right now. Could somebody?
Yes, I can hear you. Thanks.
Yeah, okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. And we would right now open the floor for some questions. And those who joined later, there's a chat box on the left-hand side where you can ask questions to Lily on the case of Peru, but also to Tony on his presentation to South Africa. So please type in your questions. And in the meanwhile, we had a question like in the beginning, which is more generally to both of you. Tony and Lily, did you generally find that climate change is well mainstreamed in the sectoral policies in the country? And if yes, did this help to integrate EBA, or was this very much used to integrate EBA? And I would like to ask Tony first, perhaps, to answer this question.
It's included in certain policies very well. For example, as mentioned, it's incorporated within our environmental policies, and to a large extent it's included in our national development plan. And South Africa at the moment is developing a climate change bill or climate change act, which really sums it up well. But what we found is that it's largely absent from the other sectors, for example, mining or industry, and that's where there's often an issue when it comes to implementation, because a mine or other forms of development can proceed without really acknowledging the climate change or the climate change adaptation impact of what they're doing, and it's not because of any malicious cause. I think they're just unaware of the potential impacts of mining or on those types of land use. And it's not to say that we're against mining or development. It's just that it needs to be developed in an appropriate manner.
Thank you very much, Tony. Lily, would you like to comment on this as well?
Thank you, Alexandra. Well, in the case of Peru, it's something similar as what Tony was mentioning. Climate change is being mainstreamed in different sectors, specifically the agriculture sector, where some years ago a plan for risk management and adaptation to climate change in the agricultural sector was adopted, and also in the forestry sector, where also a national strategy on forestry and climate change was elaborated and adopted. So let's say that the policy framework is at place. Also in the case of the natural protected areas, where vulnerability analysis have been incorporated in many of the management plans, and also there is now a high interest of integrating EBA in the same plan. So yes, it exists, let's say, on as policy instruments, but it can be noticed that there are certain challenges when it comes to implementation at the local scale, and and the identification of appropriate adaptation measures. So yes, this would be for the case of Peru more generally and shortly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lily. There's just another comment plopping up to Tony Knowles on mining or other fundamentally unsustainable industries, and how would you suggest making them more eco-friendly? Aren't we just talking about lesser evil? Why not focusing on resource recovery and reprocessing than business as usual? Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I don't know, Tony, would you like to comment on this?
Yes, I think there's, within South Africa, there's fortunately been a good shift towards trying to work with mining companies rather than against them. It has been met with various levels of success. In certain cases, despite the environmentalists' best efforts to really work with mining companies to reduce mining in areas that are highly vulnerable or highly or very important to ecosystem services and the conservation of biodiversity, the mining companies still like to pursue that. But by and large, most have become very aware of their environmental impact and are introducing measures to reduce that impact or to offset that impact. It's by no means where one would want it to be from an environmental point of view, but it's certainly a lot better than it was, say, a decade or 2 decades ago.
Okay, thank you very much, Tony, for your answer on this, and also for Lily. And with this, I would like to come to an end also due to time reasons. Thank you again to all 3 of the presenters, to Matthias for his introduction, to Lily for his excellent overview in the Peruvian case, and to Tony for presenting South African experiences. And for those of you who are keen to know more about these cases, first of all, they are all available as country reports on adaptationcommunity.net. And this webinar session is also being recorded and will be made available on adaptationcommunity.net. And I would like to advertise the next and second webinar session on entry points for EBA mainstreaming, which is going to take place on Friday, 31st of August at 10 p.m. in the morning. We will post the link on the Adaptation Community AM, sorry. In the morning, we'll post the link on the knowledge platform Adaptation Community, and we look forward to seeing you there and discuss the experiences from Asia. And with this, I would also like to invite you to give us a short feedback on the overall webinar. The link is posted in the chat box, and we would appreciate this very much. Thank you very much for your participation. If there are any further questions, you could also address me via email. And with this, thank you very much, and see you next time.